He calls 911 on black women, changing his own Wi-Fi. But what the cops uncover shocks everyone. She was 5 seconds away from being arrested. On her lawn, beneath a sky so blue, it felt almost cruel. No shouting. No weapon. Just a black woman, holding a phone in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in front of the wrong pair of eyes. Across the street, under a porch flag and 30 years of learned suspicion, a man made a decision. He picked up the phone, said she looked like she was up to something. One call, 2 officers. A neighborhood is holding its breath. Ava Brooks didn't panic. She'd learned long ago, especially in Jackson, that panic gets you nowhere. So she stood still, calm, collected. "I'm fixing my Wi-Fi," she said. But by then, the story had already written her in as the suspect. Because in this country, your silence can still be misread as a threat. And sometimes, being black is all the explanation someone thinks they need. What no one realized, not yet, was that someone had been watching all along. Not Ava, not the woman on the lawn, but a quiet figure behind firewalls and family walls, watching everyone. Stay with me, because this isn't just a misunderstanding. It's the moment a mirror gets held up, and the neighborhood blinks first, not with the law or a neighbor or a device tucked behind drywall, but with the reflex we don't talk about, the one that whispers in the space between what we see and what we assume. The part of us that still thinks quietly is suspicious, and that difference means dangerous. Ava Brooks was never a threat. She didn't break a window, shout a curse, or wave a hand too fast. She stood in her yard, like thousands of Americans do every evening, checking her phone under the sun. But her skin, her silence, her solitude, these were the things that set alarms ringing in a man's mind across the street. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she didn't do what he expected. Peter Whitaker didn't call the police out of hatred. That's too easy. He called them out of habit. A lifetime of living in a world that taught him, gently but firmly, that people like Ava should be watched, not trusted. It wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning. And that's what makes it so hard to confront, so easy to deny, so dangerous to ignore. That phone call didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred in a country where suspicion has long been associated with color. In towns where people still say, "I'm not racist," and believe it. In communities where being safe has quietly become synonymous with being familiar, and familiar still too often means white. So when Peter saw Ava outside with her phone, he didn't know that she was resetting her router. He saw a question mark, a variable, something that didn't fit the picture he was used to. And the story began writing itself. Maybe she was filming houses. Maybe she was stealing the internet. Perhaps she was casing the neighborhood. And just like that, the truth was replaced with a theory. Because that's how these things start. Not with malice, but with a look, a thought, a phone call. And once that narrative takes hold, it moves fast. It builds steam. It gets backed by uniforms and badges and all the silent permissions that say, better safe than sorry. But safe for whom? The truth is, Peter felt uneasy, and instead of sitting with that feeling, he exported it. He handed it off to the police. Because that's what power allows you to do. Turn your discomfort into someone else's danger. No questions asked. And Ava? She was left to prove herself innocent in a house she owns, on a street she's lived on for years. Her dignity was collateral in someone else's fear. That's not justice. That's a quiet violence. The kind you can't see bruises from, but it still takes something from you, still leaves a mark. This isn't about one call. It's about how quickly an ordinary moment in America can unravel into accusation when bias wears the mask of concern. It's about the emotional toll of being constantly mistaken for a problem when all you're trying to do is live your life with some peace. Because if being quiet is threatening, and being alone is suspicious, and being black is reason enough to call the cops, then what hope do we have for fairness? What chance does trust have to grow? That's the reckoning not just of systems, but of selves. And it starts here, in the quiet, in a front yard, in a breath held too long, in the echo of a story we thought we'd already learned, but keep repeating anyway. Stay with me, because it only gets more real from here. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a neighborhood isn't the person you don't recognize. It's the one you know too well. The face you've grown used to. The voice you've stopped listening to. The hands that wave politely, but carry something darker when no one's looking. While Ava Brooks stood under suspicion for simply being there, the actual threat was coming from within the walls of the very house that had raised the alarm. Not a prowler, not an outsider, but a girl upstairs in her bedroom, hoodie on, lights off, screen glowing blue, long past midnight. Carla Whitaker, 23, quiet, withdrawn, brilliant in a way that makes people nervous. She'd lived in her grandfather's house since the pandemic, after dropping out of a coding boot camp she never really loved. Peter told the neighbors she was just figuring things out. But what she was doing, behind firewalls and fake networks, was watching, listening, digging into people's private lives like it was a game. And no one suspected her. Why would they? She wasn't Ava. She was familiar. She was one of ours. That's what makes it so cruel. Peter wasn't wrong to be afraid. He just pointed his fear in the wrong direction. He gave it a face he didn't understand, while the real danger lived under his roof, drank his coffee, kissed his cheek goodnight. Because Carla didn't break in, she logged in. She didn't wear a mask. She used code. And while she wasn't kicking in doors, she was invading something just as sacred. Trust, security, the illusion of safety we build with fences and porch lights, and the myth that danger always looks like them, never us. She hacked into Wi-Fi signals all over Rosemary Lane. Ava's, the Johnsons, even Peter's system. She didn't steal credit cards or money. She stole presence. She took people's peace and turned it into surveillance. Living rooms became a theater. Bedrooms became windows, and no one knew they were being watched until it was far too late. The irony is brutal. Ava, the one being watched, was the first to notice, the first to act, the only one paying attention, and she was the one labeled suspicious. Meanwhile, Carla was curious, gifted, just a little lost. How many times have we heard that? How many stories have been told with that excuse, while other people are forced to prove they belong in their own homes, on their porches, with their names on the mailbox, and fear in their gut? This is the part of the reckoning we rarely speak aloud. That proximity doesn't equal purity. That shared blood isn't the same as shared values. That evil, or at least danger, doesn't always come crashing through the window. Sometimes it sits at your dinner table. Sometimes it wears your last name. And here's the thing. Carla didn't do it out of malice. She did it because she could. Because no one ever taught her that watching people without their knowledge is a form of violation. Because some people are raised with so much trust, they never realize how easily it can be weaponized. So while Ava stood outside proving her innocence, the girl in the attic was inside erasing hers. And Peter? He never saw it coming because he was too busy fearing what looked unfamiliar to notice what had been right under his roof, behind a closed door, for months. This story doesn't end where you think it does. Because reckoning isn't just about confronting others. It's about asking, what have I ignored? Who have I protected? And why was I so sure the problem was out there, when it was right here, beside me, all along? Stay with me. The truth isn't finished speaking yet. Dignity doesn't make headlines. It doesn't shout. It doesn't break windows or flood the streets with slogans. But when wielded by someone who's been wrongly accused, someone who has every reason to scream but chooses stillness instead, it becomes unmistakably powerful. Ava Brooks stood in the middle of a false narrative and never once raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her truth was louder than accusation. Her calmness is a kind of rebellion. Because in America, when a black woman refuses to perform her pain, refuses to fold or flinch, the world doesn't quite know what to do with her. Peter had expected fear, or at the very least an apology, but Ava gave him neither. What she offered instead was clarity. She showed him the data, the logs, and the feed, evidence, not anger, facts, not pleading. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for grace. She asked only for eyes to see what was already there. And somehow, that shook him more than any outburst could have, because we are conditioned to believe that justice must arrive with volume, that it has to break the silence to be heard. But Ava turned silence into a scalpel. She carved the truth out of the air with precision, with patience, and with a kind of spiritual authority that cannot be learned, only lived. Something is devastating about that kind of composure. It forces a mirror onto everyone watching. It says, look at me. Now look at you. And tell me, who here has something to prove? When Carla was escorted from the house in handcuffs, Ava didn't gloat. She didn't look satisfied. Her expression didn't change. Because for people like her, vindication is never clean. There is no celebration in being proven right when the cost is trust and the currency is suspicion. She didn't need revenge. What she wanted, what she deserved, was something quieter, deeper, and far harder to give. Recognition. Not applause, not pity. Just a simple acknowledgement that what happened to her wasn't fair, and that it shouldn't have taken this much proof for someone to believe her. And that's the ache in the middle of this story. That a woman can live with integrity, skill, and grace, and still be questioned for how she looks holding a phone on her lawn. It's not just about racism. It's about who we decide is safe, and who must constantly earn that label over and over again, no matter how many times they've done nothing wrong. Ava never asked to be a symbol, but that's what she became. A quiet resistance to the roles people tried to cast her in. She wasn't a victim, but she was violated. She wasn't loud, but she was heard. And she didn't demand justice, she revealed it. When she turned to Peter and said, "You called the police on me for protecting myself." It wasn't an accusation. It was a benediction. A final, clear-eyed truth hung in the Mississippi air like smoke from a fire nobody admitted they had started. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning played at low volume, so low that only the guilty could hear it ring. And if that unsettled people, it should have. Because real justice doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it comes with a woman standing still, refusing to explain herself one more time, and daring the world to face its reflection. Stay with me. The final truth is still waiting to be spoken. Peter Whitaker thought he was a good man. He paid his taxes, served his country, read the local paper. He'd raised 2 boys, taught 30 years in the public school system, and kept a flag on the porch not out of politics, but tradition. He liked to believe he'd earned the right to feel safe in his neighborhood, and for the most part, he did. Until the day he called the police on Ava Brooks. He didn't do it out of hatred. That word didn't fit the shape of his heart. He felt uneasy. Something about her, standing out there alone, tapping away on her phone with a look he couldn't quite read. It didn't add up. It didn't match the rhythm of the street. And so, with nothing more than a feeling, he dialed the number and said the words, "Something's not right." But here's the thing about not right. It's slippery. It can mean danger, or simply unfamiliarity. It can mean threat, or just a break from routine. And when you've lived a life where your instincts have always been trusted, you forget they can be wrong. Peter didn't hate Ava. He didn't know her. And that's precisely the problem. He didn't see her. Not really. He saw what she wasn't. Warm, chatty, familiar. He saw silence and mistook it for secrecy. He saw her skin and let his fear fill in the rest. And because he'd never learned to question that fear, he gave it authority. He gave it a badge, a siren, a stage. That's what unconscious bias looks like. It doesn't wear a hood or shout in the streets. It wears a button-down shirt and says, "I just thought." It hides in polite voices and the benefit of the doubt, granted to some, withheld from others. And the damage it causes? It ripples. It humiliates. It humiliates quietly, efficiently, and under the complete protection of concern. Peter didn't set out to humiliate Ava. He didn't wake up intending to paint her as a suspect. But when he looked back at the moment, at the way she stood still while officers questioned her, at the way she had to explain herself without ever having done anything wrong, something cracked inside him. For the first time he realized that his fear had consequences. His assumptions weren't private. They came with weight. They arrived with flashing lights. They reshaped someone's day, someone's dignity, someone's memory of what it means to live peacefully on a street like this. The worst part? Ava didn't even ask for an apology. She just told the truth. And that truth didn't scream. It just stood there. A mirror. Quiet. Unflinching. Peter saw himself in that mirror, and he didn't like what looked back. He began to understand that being a good man wasn't enough. That fairness isn't inherited through age or upbringing. It's earned through the uncomfortable work of unlearning, through the courage to sit with the question, what if I've been wrong? That's the hardest kind of reckoning, the one where no one else is to blame but you. Because real change doesn't start with policies or protests. It begins in living rooms. In thoughts we don't say aloud. In feelings we never thought to challenge until they harmed someone we couldn't ignore anymore. Peter never said the words, "I'm sorry." But when he stopped calling people like Ava other, that's when the story began to change. Stay with me. The truth has one more turn to take. The most dangerous stories are the ones we think we already understand. That's what makes this one so potent, not just because it happened, but because it started so small, a Wi-Fi reset. A quiet woman is on her porch. A neighbor with a feeling. The ingredients were ordinary. The consequences were not. The first lie was the assumption. The second was how quickly people believed it. And the third, the most painful of all, was the idea that anyone ever knew what was happening in the first place. Ava Brooks had no warning, no heads up. One moment, she was tending to her internet connection, and the next, she was defending her existence. That's how fast a truth can get buried beneath someone else's fear. That's how easily a life can be redefined by a sentence that starts with, "I don't know why, but." When the police arrived, They didn't have the necessary context. They had a call, and that call had a tone, a rhythm, a suggestion disguised as concern. And once that suggestion turned into protocol, the rest unfolded like it always does. Suspicion before evidence. Questioning before understanding. Doubt before dignity. But the truth, as it always does, found a way through. It came in the form of a log file, a trail of access points, an invisible fingerprint left behind by someone who thought they were too clever to be caught. It came in the form of names, neighbors, families, being watched through their cameras, their own devices, inside the very walls they thought kept them safe. And suddenly, everything shifted. The story turned on itself. Because the threat wasn't the woman on the porch, it was the house 3 doors down. The quiet girl in the attic. The trusted bloodline. The one no one would have guessed. It's jarring how fast certainty can fall apart. 1 minute you're sure. Next, you're ashamed. The narrative you believed so confidently becomes a fog, and in that fog, you're forced to ask yourself questions you haven't faced in years. How did I get this so wrong? Why did I trust my instincts without asking where they came from? And what damage did I do while I thought I was protecting something? This story isn't about tech. It's not even really about crime. It's about the illusions we protect because they're comfortable, and the truths we avoid because they're not. It's about the ease with which we label people suspicious, and the laziness of thinking that justice only lives in the loud, the criminal, the dramatic. Sometimes, truth walks in quietly and rearranges the room. That's what Ava did. She didn't break anything. She didn't expose anyone with fury or spectacle. She just refused to disappear. And in doing so, she became the one person willing to look deeper. Not just into her router settings, but into the silence between people. The assumptions we treat as fact. The lies we tell ourselves to keep the world small and safe. By the end, even Peter understood. What he thought was protecting the neighborhood had endangered it. His version of safety was never built on truth. It was built on a story that had never been challenged, until Ava stood still long enough to make it unravel. So no, this story didn't start with a scream, but it ended with something louder. A revelation. Stay with me. There's still one last truth that needs to be said aloud, and once it is, we won't be able to go back. When the cruiser pulled away, when the cuffs had clicked shut behind Carla's back, when the last question had been answered and the police radios had gone quiet, a different kind of silence settled on Rosemary Lane. Not the silence of peace, the silence of realization. Peter stood in the middle of his porch, hands limp at his sides, the screen door creaking behind him like it wanted to say something he couldn't. There were no more lights, no more commands, just Ava, walking away, not triumphant, not even relieved, just done. And that was the part that lingered, because she didn't want revenge, she didn't want headlines, she didn't turn her pain into a weapon or her vindication into a speech. She left Peter standing there with nothing but the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding, that his instincts were flawed, that his assumptions had power, and that power, when misplaced, could hurt people quietly, completely. Ava didn't explain herself. She didn't need to. She'd already done what needed to be done. She showed them, not who she was, but who they had decided she couldn't be. And now that the story had cracked open, she refused to help them piece it back together in a way that made anyone feel comfortable. There would be no "we all make mistakes" here, no warm bow tied around a lesson learned. Because some truths aren't meant to soothe, they're meant to stay with you, to sit at your table, to keep you up at night. Peter watched her door close and knew something had changed, not just in how he saw her, but how he saw himself. Because the worst part wasn't that he'd called the police, it was that he still didn't know precisely when the doubt had entered his heart. It had slipped in quietly, dressed as caution, and sat beside him like an old friend. And now, that friend had a face. Her name was Ava Brooks. That's what stories like this leave behind. Not just broken trust, but a mirror. A long, slow reflection that stretches past the news cycle and settles deep in the bones of a community. It forces people to remember, and to ask themselves, what else have I missed? Who else have I judged? How many times have I mistaken discomfort for danger? Ava didn't ask for that reckoning, but she held the door open for it anyway. That's what made her unforgettable. Not the drama, not the confrontation, but the choice to speak once, clearly, and then leave everyone else to sit with what they'd heard. In the end, she didn't need to punish anyone. She just refused to let them pretend nothing had happened. And that silence, the one Peter stood in, the one his neighbors pretended not to notice, became the loudest part of all. It hummed through dinner tables. It curled beneath small talk. It lingered in the way folks waved, then quickly looked away. Because Ava hadn't just walked through a misunderstanding. She'd walked through a wall, one made of polite smiles and unspoken suspicions. And when she walked back into her house, that wall didn't go back up. It stayed broken, cracked, exposed. And maybe that's what change looks like. Not a speech, not a protest, but a woman who refuses to fold. A silence that forces accountability. A neighborhood that can't go back to pretending it knows its people just because it knows their names. Stay with me. The story's not over. Because sometimes the quietest exits are the ones we remember most. And the people we once misunderstood are the ones we ultimately need to understand the most. There's something about stories like Ava Brooks that doesn't let you walk away unchanged. Because it's not just about what happened to her, it's about what could happen to any of us. About what we choose to see, who we choose to question, and how easily we can be wrong, even with the best of intentions. If you were in Ava's place, would you have stood your ground the way she did? Calm, dignified, unshaken by judgment? And if you were on the other end of that porch, making the call, would you have paused long enough to ask yourself why? This isn't just her story. It's a mirror. And it's asking all of us. When truth knocks, will we recognize its voice, or mistake it for noise? If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen, unsettled, or inspired, remember to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue telling stories that matter. And more than anything, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did this story make you feel? Every comment you leave fuels the fire for more truth to be told. Thank you for listening. Truly.